So that was my first.
Now you started to say that the book. Did the book start to play any kind of role in your career? Did people start talking to you about Hackworth's book?
No, not really.
Okay.
What I mean by that is, the whole stance that he took about Vietnam, to risk his career and just saying, hey, I'm out of here, because I've done this now for 30-something years, and frankly, it was weighing on him. I mean, talk about the moral injury of knowing that you're leading soldiers in combat when the policy could have been done better,
right?
Which would have resulted in fewer casualties.
Yeah, that's. I don't know if there's a heavier weight to bear than that. That's a heavy one. And then what was the next thing you took a stance on?
Well, the next thing that happened, which caused the end of my career, basically, is...
I like that you say that with a smile on your face.
Well, I don't regret a day.
There you go.
If I had to do it again today, I'd do it in a heartbeat. And here's what happened. I was an Army Reserve guy, so for full transparency to your listeners... Okay, I was on active duty for 5 years. I was on an Army Reservist for 27 years. Okay, now the Army has 3 components. They have the active component, they have the Army Reserve, and they have the Army National Guard. Okay, the Army Reserve and Army National Guard are the so-called reserve components. Okay, now the active Army, of course, are the 24/7. That's their full-time job. The Army Reserves are a federal force, and the Army Reserves fall into the normal Army chain of command, Department of the Army. We answer to the orders of the President. Okay? Army National Guard does not fall into that chain of command, nor do they report to the President. They report to the governors of each state. It's really a state organization, although 95% of their budget comes from the federal government. Okay? And as an Army Reservist for 27 years, I saw whenever it came to reducing the Army force structure, the Army Reserves would always get the short end. And the Guard would always be protected. Okay, the actives would always take care of themselves. That was never an issue. Okay, but the so-called one Army concept, where everybody's supposed to be together in this, the reserves always got the short end of the stick. And the reason for that is the reserves were a national force. Okay, we were professional in the military, as you know. You're not supposed to be political. You're supposed to be apolitical, right? Not involved in lobbying and stuff like that. The National Guard is very political. It's jobs for the state. Okay? So whenever the National Guard has so much political clout, if you look at any presidential election, just watch the week before the election in November. That's when the Guard normally has their national convention in D.C., okay? And I can tell you, every major presidential candidate shows up, okay? And keep in mind, they have the political support of a governor, 2 senators, and the congressman, right? The Army Reserve doesn't have that political clout. So frankly, we've always gotten screwed. And so I watched that for 25 years. I said enough is enough. And so I founded a 501c3 organization called the Army Reserve Association, which was comprised of officers, enlisted, and civilians. The mission was to educate the public and Congress about the Army Reserves, because people, when they hear of the reserves, they think of the National Guard. They don't think of the Army Reserves, which has armories, and they have soldiers in every state in our union. But people don't think about that, okay? So when Desert Storm ended, right? When Desert Storm hit, the Army mobilized both National Guard and reserve units, okay? The National Guard had, now, full transparency, as I said, I'm an Army Reserve guy, okay? So I'm pretty jaded on this, if you want to say that. But, you know, the National Guard has great patriots. I'm not casting aspersions on them at all, you know. But facts are facts. And here's what happened. When Desert Storm hit, the National Guard had 3 so-called premier infantry brigades that were supposed to round out active duty divisions. Okay, one of them was the 48th out of Georgia. Okay, and there was a National Guard brigade that, upon mobilization, they would be assigned to that division, and they would go to war with the division. Okay, and what happened was, when it came, and by the way, they had all the best equipment. They had better equipment than some active Army battalions and brigades. They had Abrams tanks. You have to understand, this is the early 90s. They had Abrams tanks and they had Bradley vehicles, when a lot of active units didn't have that, okay? But they were publicized as being the premier Army National Guard combat units that were ready to go to war, okay? When the balloon went up, the Army said, we can't send these guys. They're just going to be cannon fodder. So they sent them to the NTC, the National Training Center in California, for 90 days, okay? Only problem was the war ended so quick they never got there. All right? The reserves, on the other hand, our soldiers performed magnificently. We had helicopter units, we had medical units, we had civil affairs, we had PSYOPs, you know, our people did extremely. My training division, perfect example. You know, we were mobilized. I had my guys in the front gates of Fort Benning within 72 hours. And my drill instructors were on the trail. My instructors were on the platform teaching, you know, running the ranges and all that.
And so then when it came time to downsize, is that where you took a stand? Yeah,
absolutely. What happened was that, you know, when we win the Desert Storm, and then the Soviet Union falls apart and the wall comes down, right? So everybody's looking for this peace dividend to transfer money from the Defense Department to social services, okay? And so the Army has a process that's called the Total Army Analysis. It's a very good, logical process so you can determine the force structure that we need for the Army, okay? And the way it works is you look at what are we facing throughout the world? You know, what are the problem areas, you know, and then you say to yourself, okay, based on that, how many divisions infantry divisions do we need? How many armored units? How many helicopter battalions? You know, blah, blah, blah. And then you face reality and you say, how much money can we really get out of Congress for this? So based on all that stuff, you come up with a force structure, okay? The Army didn't do that. What they did is they had the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, the Chief of Army Reserves, the Chief of the National Guard Bureau, the President of the National Guard Association, which is not a government group, and the President of the Reserve Officers Association go to a hotel and they cut a deal. And it was called the off-site agreement because it wasn't done at the Pentagon, okay? Well, I told you I had formed this Army Reserve Association, all right? I had people in that meeting. Within 5 minutes, I knew what happened. And the Army Reserves really, they eliminated 80% of Army Reserve aviation. And we had 4 Special Forces groups at that time in the reserve components. There were 2 National Guard groups, the 19th and 20th, and 2 Army Reserve Special Forces groups, the 11th and the 12th. the 12th was one of the units that I was under my command. I was the deputy commanding general of an Army Reserve unit. So I'll give you an example. We had a Black Hawk battalion, once again in my Army Reserve under my command, that fought in the Gulf. They were so good that Schwarzkopf selected them for his taxi unit, okay? And they had received it's called the Army Aviation Association Award, AAA Award, for the best Black Hawk battalion. So that's how good these guys were, okay? This agreement eliminated that unit out of the Army Reserves and put it into the Illinois National Guard, okay? Now, I'm a big boy. I can accept, I don't appreciate it as a taxpayer, but I can accept waste of money or whatever. Where I draw the line in the sand is when you jeopardize soldiers' lives and the readiness of our forces, okay? This unit overnight, what I didn't tell you was the Illinois National Guard did not have one qualified Black Hawk pilot or mechanic. They could not even fly those birds from Scott Air Force Base, where we had them, to the Illinois National Guard field. They had to go to the Wisconsin and Minnesota Guard to borrow pilots so they could move those birds. Now, the implication is that unit overnight went from C1, the highest readiness rating, down to C5, which is non-deployable. Basically, and it took about 3 years plus to get that unit up to C3, which is just marginal deployment level. Okay, so that's one example. Another example are those special forces groups. Okay, the Army looked at the 4 reserve component special forces groups, and they said, we only need 2. Okay, so we'll eliminate the National Guard, groups, because why does the National Guard why does the governor need a Farsi-speaking demolitions expert? Okay, and the last time I looked, we didn't have an insurgency in Illinois, so the National Guard says no, we don't accept that. So the Army, with their tail between their legs, go back to the drawing board, and they looked at readiness, which is what they probably should have done to begin with. And they found out that the 12th group in the in the Army Reserves was the best out of the 4. And then it was I think it was the 20th out of the Guard was the second best. So they said, okay, we got the solution. We'll take 1 out of each component, right? Guard wouldn't accept that.
Jeez.
So what did they do? They eliminated both Army Reserve, groups. And I was livid, because the 12th was under me at one time. I wasn't the commander of it, but it was in my chain. Mm-hmm. We had taken that unit from C4 to C2, which for a reserve unit to be able to get reservists to pass those special forces qualifications, that's not easy, okay? And they eliminated that unit. Now, I'm a big boy. Okay, when it came to the helicopter units, and I said, okay, take my pilots and mechanics, take the reserve patch off their shoulder, make them National Guardsmen. I'm good with it. Okay, they wouldn't do it because it was jobs for the Guard. So my guys had to find new jobs. Some of them had to actually change MOSs. Because there were no aviation jobs for them, right? And just think, you and I as taxpayers, how much that cost us. So now I'm getting all kinds of calls from the field. We didn't have computers at that time in the internet, so I'd get telephone calls and faxes saying, General, somebody's got to stand up and fight this. And that meeting I told you about that they had, I found out from my moles that, in essence, they were going to have a press conference the next day where everybody was going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and say that the Army has come up with this great agreement where everybody agrees and nobody disagrees. Well, that wasn't true. Mm-hmm. A lot of people disagreed with it. So I called the Vice Chief of Staff's office at the Pentagon, right? Not as Major General Jim Mukoyama, but as Jim Mukoyama, President, Army Reserve Association. Okay? So I call asking for a return call about this press conference that's going to happen, or announcement, you know, and I didn't get a call back. So the next morning, an hour before their press conference, we sent out a press release. And we basically said, this is not good. This is, you know, shouldn't go through, need to have a GAO study, a Government Accounting Office study. And that pretty well got me into the crosshairs. And so then what we did is, and now keep in mind, I had never done this in my life. I had never lobbied. I had never been to Congress. I had never walked the halls, you know, any of that stuff. We had we actually, and I think I might have sent you some of this stuff, but we had a meeting of the Army Reserve Association called for it in Washington, D.C. And I had men and women come from all over the country. And we went and we lobbied our senators and congressmen, and we told them this is wrong. There needs to be a GAO study. It needs to be studied before it's implemented. Okay. Now, frankly, I knew we were tilting at windmills, but I had to do it because, you know, I was getting all these requests from sergeants and civilians and lieutenants and majors throughout the country saying somebody's got to fight this, and they were right. So I had to do it. So then I get an invitation from a congressional subcommittee. Okay? It was not a subpoena, so I didn't have to go. I could have said I've got a headache or I've got a conflict or whatever, but I didn't. You know, I said, yeah, I'll be there. And I went and I testified. And a year later, I was history, shall we say. But it's, like I said, Jocko, I wouldn't hesitate in a moment to do it again. It's when I was in Vietnam, I knew that our generals were not standing up for us all the time like they should. And I said, ever get to a point in life where it's the difference between my career and my soldiers. The soldiers win. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's one of those balance things too, is, you know, as a leader, what, you know, you want to toe the line. And I have people ask me this pretty regularly. Well, you know, you always say you want to support the chain of command, but what if the chain of command is wrong? Well, it's a real simple answer. If the chain of command is wrong and it's something that matters, like the safety of your troops, the training of your troops, then you stand up to it. Yeah. You know, if it's something that doesn't matter, if they go, oh, we want you to fill out this paperwork differently than you did it yesterday. You know what I do? Yeah. I do it. Right. I don't care. Yeah. You know, you want me to put my uniform on this way instead of that way? That's fine. Whatever. I'll do it. You want to start putting soldiers at jeopardy? That won't stand.
So here's what happened. Okay. While all this stuff is going on, the Washington Post puts this front page. Okay. Oh. And it talks about how this big controversy, you know, and my association is right at the forefront of all this. So I'm quoted in all of it. Now, keep in mind, I'm still an active Army Reserve Major General at TRADOC, right? And in fact, before I testified, I got a call from the Chief of Staff at TRADOC, who's a good friend of mine. We were both Major Generals. And he didn't tell me I shouldn't go. He kind of said that, well, you know, it's really not a good idea, you know, for you to go. And he was a good friend of mine. And I said, John, you know, I understand you have to do this. This is your job, but I got to go. I cannot stand by and let this pass. So and so that was also in the Washington Post, you know, like I was threatened. I wasn't threatened, you know. Oh, okay. And so basically, then the Army Times wrote an editorial, which basically criticized the Army Reserves, especially my association, you know, and saying the Army Reserves are not team players; they're crybabies, you know. But what got me is when they said they're putting out bad information. Okay, that was in their editorial. Okay, so I wrote an op-ed. Okay, which to their credit they published.
Good for them. Yep.
And in the op-ed, I said, number one, where is and the title of their editorial was "The Enemy Is Us." Okay, and I said, I agree with you. The enemy is us. But the problem is, number one, where is, you didn't list in detail the false information that was being put out by the reserves. So you need to do that. I said that in the op-ed. They never did, by the way, because we had never put out anything false. But the second thing I said, if we go to war in the next 18 months, and this thing goes through, we're going to have people coming back in body bags that would not have. I mean, now that's a pretty serious statement.
It is indeed.
Okay? And you would think, if I was Chicken Little saying the sky was falling, that they would have been inundated with letters from the field saying, the general's gone too far, right? They didn't get one letter. And so because of the stand I took, needless to say, the Army wasn't real happy with me. And a year later, when it came time to get a new assignment, surprise, surprise, I was not considered. There were no assignments that I was considered eligible for. And so I said, this has been fun. So the Chief of Army Reserve actually wanted me to stay. And he said, this too shall pass. So why don't you stay? You can go into control group, which is kind of this administrative pool of people who don't have assignments. And maybe in a year or two, you can come back. We'll get you an assignment. And I said, no. I said, the Army's made it very clear. They don't want my services. They don't think I have any value, and I'm going to move on. I got to move on in life. And so that's what I did.